All right, thanks very much for inviting me here today to speak to you and share a little bit of Statistics Canada's data with you. Yeah, my presentation is going to be about looking at Canada's household balance sheets. I suppose in light of the three presentations, it's a bit more like Ray's, I guess, starting off. Those last two were really, really interesting, though. That idea of being able to break down income flows and consumption flows to a sub-annual level and really look at the payments as they come and go from people's bank accounts is it's just really fascinating. I wish I could tell you some more about it. Okay, so I'm going to try and press a button here and see if this works for me. Excellent. Okay, so in my research preparing for this presentation today, I came across something referred to as the crushed avocado debate. Has anybody here heard of the crushed avocado debate? A couple, eh? Yeah, it's a millennial thing. The debate was sparked by a tongue-in-cheek opinion piece published in an Australian magazine, and it became a viral sensation. And a middle-aged columnist sort of lashed out indignantly about the spending patterns of the younger generation. And I guess the kicker was, he basically witnessed, firsthand millennials, or people he thought looked like millennials, eating an expensive lunch. And he said to himself, I think really tongue-in-cheek, he wasn't really, but he wrote it, said, shouldn't they be economizing by eating at home? How often are they eating out? $22 several times a week could go towards a deposit on a house. So it became a kind of a viral sensation, I think, for a little while, and I invite anybody who's interested in crawling down that rabbit hole to take a look at the smashed avocado debate and some of the social media around it. But what the debate did for me was it motivated me to think about what the financial data for Canada tells us about what's going on across generations. Are the millennials as a generation faring poorly relative to generations of the past? And if so, in what dimensions is that happening? And what are some of the challenges facing Canadians of whatever generation? And how are they addressing them? So in this presentation today, I'm going to draw fairly heavily from something at Statistics Canada called the Survey of Financial Security, which was first run really as something called the Assets and Debt Survey in 1984, and was most recently run in 2016. And this survey goes to a representative sample of Canadian households and essentially goes through a balance sheet for them. So it asks about all of their assets and all of their debts and collects a lot of other information about their incomes and comes out with values for net worth for a representative group of Canadians. And just sort of broadly speaking, the trends are shown here. We have a rising level of household assets, a rising level of household debt, a rising level of net worth. And then on the right channel there, we see the debt to income ratio a little bit more blown up. And there you see, the Survey of Financial Security's analog of the famous, $1.70 or whatever the number is this quarter for the debt to income ratio. And it's important to say that these statistics here they're gathered at the household level. So what's sort of unfortunate is we can't say in a couple family how much of these assets are controlled by the female partner versus the male partner and that kind of thing. So everything's grouped up at the household level. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through it. And later on, sometimes I'm going to be showing you statistics that are by age group or by generation or by educational attainment. And of course, a household doesn't have an age group or an educational attainment. So rather than walk away, I just assign the household the age group or the educational attainment of the major income earner. So that's the person in the household that earns the most money. Before diving into these financial data, though, I'm going to remind us about something that's sometimes forgotten in debates about differences between groups, such as millennials versus boomers or whatever, is that there are really large vertical inequalities in Canada, as there are in many countries. So this graph here shows results from a different set of surveys for household incomes going back to 1976. And the big takeaway from here is the widening differences between between households that are faring fairly successfully and those maybe closer to the median or towards the bottom. Obviously, accumulation of these income disparities over a lifetime, suggests that some families will have much greater potential to invest and build up their wealth over their lifetime than others. So that's kind of a background piece that I want to carry with this, and how important it is to think about these sorts of cross-sectional inequalities as well. But back to the financial data. So those big variations in household income values, they map over to big variations in household financials. So here we have household net worth by selected percentile going back to 1999. And so we have the 25th, the 50th, and the 75th percentile of households in Canada. And the main takeaway from this is this is also widening, just like the income distribution. So there's massive. The difference between the gray dot and the blue dot would be what statisticians would call the interquartile range. So that's sort of the part of the distribution that 50% of the households sit in. And the range for this is in absolute terms much higher than it used to be, suggesting that some families are doing much better than others. But back to my generation story. So what I do is I look at the data and I cut it according to different generations. And I don't want anybody to complain that I put them as a Generation X when they feel more like a millennial, or a Generation Xer when they think that they're more of a boomer. There really aren't any tried and true religious ways of identifying generations, with the exception of the baby boomers, for whom you actually have a distinct demographic event, that being the baby boom itself, that allows demographers to sort of date the beginning and the end of it. Rather, I wanted to sort of use this as an illustrative feature. Interestingly, maybe everybody doesn't know this, but the millennials, there's actually more millennials out there now than there are baby boomers. As of the last census, they surpassed them in population size. But of course, there are not as many households that are millennial households, because many millennials, are, as you can see, the age is 16, so they're still living with their boomer or Gen X parents. And likewise, we all know also that millennials as a generation could be described as slow to launch, in a sense. The census, for example, shows that millennials are more often found in their parents' home than previous generations were. Oh, and the most important thing, these two graphs at the bottom, we show the median after-tax income and the median net worth of these households. And they show, they show reasonable patterns. You see net income or after-tax income rises and peaks for individuals in their 40s and 50s, and then falls thereafter. Median net worth rises to 600,000, but then falls thereafter. And these are perfectly reasonable. The thing is, though, is these doesn't really answer our question, right? The question that I posed at the beginning, are millennials doing worse off than the baby boomers or the Gen X? And to sort of do that, you need to look at them at the same age, not just using one cross-section, but you have to construct the data to look at a bunch of cross-sections. So, yeah, of course. I can hardly see it myself.
Which one is it?
Maybe you could just do the percentage increase.
Yeah. Oh, here. Okay, please.
Okay, so. Super. Well, that's much better. Yeah, thanks. So where was I? I was talking about how those little sort of cross-sectional age profiles were reasonable, but not really getting us to where we want to be. In order to do that, we have to construct something like synthetic panels of individuals and follow them over time. So I do that using 3 cycles of this Survey of Financial Security. The source there also should add the 1984 data to that, which I'm able to use for the median debt. But if you wonder, does this have a laser on it, perhaps? No? Okay, I'm not going to touch that. So basically the idea is, if you look at the gray line on the left, and it says median assets, and that's for the baby boomers. So what we do is we look at the baby boomers when they're age 40 to 49, and we pick that up in the 1999 survey. And then we look at the baby boomers when they're 55 to 64, and we pick that up from the 2016 survey. So they're not the exact same people, but it's the same representative cohort of people over time. And the main takeaway from this, which I think is interesting, is that across these major financial categories, the profiles are ratcheting upwards, where each subsequent cohort seems to have higher values in each of these assets, debts, and net worth categories. And even among the millennials, when we look at the assets and the debt and the net worth, they've also upped their game in terms of holding more of these either financial pluses or minuses as part of their balance sheet. So going back to looking at what that looks like in terms of divergences among people, we can look at the same data, except this time instead of looking at just the medians, we're going to look at that interquartile range that I talked about. So let's look at those two bars in the middle, the ones labeled Gen X and Boomer. So here we're looking at 8 people aged 40 to 49, and we're looking at them at the same age but at different points in time. And we can see that boomers, have an interquartile range of, well, that much. So, I don't know, something less than $400,000, whereas the Gen X has an interquartile range that's nearly twice that. So there's this massive variation in financial outcomes for people. And it's all stretching at the top, right? So the people at the bottom aren't, like the 25th percentile is still at the 25th percentile. It's not changing much, but there's a lot of increase in net worth for individuals at the age, or at the top of the income distribution. So that's really my first point. There are a lot of differences in outcomes, both across the generations, as you can see by the shifts in the medians in all the previous graphs that I showed you before, and within generations in terms of these widening results in terms of their financial results. So that's my first generation or my first result about thinking about going back to the avocado debate. Many millennials are doing well in terms of their start in life, and Gen Xers, of course, have done very well, and Boomers have done well, and in fact, in many of these indicators, subsequent generations are doing better than the previous ones, but not for everybody. So that's about halfway through my presentation, which is good because I might get Liz back on time, back on schedule. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of it is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these generations in turn and reflect a bit on their major challenges. And through that, I'll come to my second point. And this is what my second point is. It's that inequalities between households within each generation are in part associated with household characteristics such as their educational attainment or their family structure. Okay, so this won't be much of a surprise to people in the room. But the idea being that we're going to see, and I only have a limited time. I can't show you a million different things, but I'll show you a few different things that demonstrate that many of these financial indicators vary depending upon things such as how much human capital is in the household, how many people are able to be there contributing to that human capital, and how much income they have. I meant to talk about this graph before I moved on. Basically, what are millennials doing? Okay, so millennials are getting older, but really they've done a lot of investing in their own human capital. So the graph on the left shows the share of individuals with a post-secondary degree, and this includes apprenticeships and trades and basically anything higher than high school. And millennials have invested a lot in themselves in this way. And of course, you can even imagine that those numbers would go up a little bit for millennials because a lot of them are likely not finished their educations yet. The panel on the right shows that one of the ways that they're doing this is financing it through student loans. About 26% of millennials had student debt, and that the bar chart shows among the student debt holders the highest amounts was $20,000 for university graduates. So millennials are investing in their human capital, and you can see why. People are probably fairly familiar with earnings premiums by different educational attainment, showing that university grads and university grads from particular fields of study make more than non-grads or high school grads. The premium can shift over time, but it's consistently positive. This graph shows that the same sort of premium is observed in these financials as well. So here I focus just on the net worth, but the picture for assets or debts or anything like principal residence value or anything like that would be fairly similar. And it shows basically the difference in median net worth according to which educational attainment you have. And obviously it can be quite large, and it seems to grow across generations, probably as net worth rises for individuals. So we see it there in the Generation X, for example, has a fairly healthy premium for a university degree in terms of their net worth over a high school graduate. And even among millennials, who are really relatively early in their career and early in their generation of net worth, have a $100,000 premium for completing university. So it's no surprise that they're investing so much in their education. They're also investing in their housing assets. That ties into the previous graph, but it's true that millennials, as sort of household heads, there's the issue of the failure to launch, and there's the issue of they're still pretty young, and there's the issue of the one that I raised at the top here, the issue that even among millennials that strike out on their own, they do tend to be less likely to be purchasing a home. But nevertheless, 50% of millennials, according to the census, who have gone out and started their own households are in homes that they own. And that's a little bit lower than boomers 25, 30 years ago, but it's not so much lower that you'd think, wow, that's a really gigantic change. It's only 5% lower. And then we skip over to the SFS, so some of the numbers aren't perfectly comparable, so don't worry about the differences in the rates very much. But according to the SFS, about 40% of these millennials, of millennials had a mortgage, not of these, but of millennials overall had a mortgage. And the mortgage holder median was about $206,000. So millennials had if you're a millennial and you're a mortgage holder, your median was about $206,000. And if you look at the bottom point there where it says SFS, Generation X mortgage holder at the same age had a little less income actually, but has a lot less mortgage. So they had a mortgage of $114,000 at some point, say 1999 instead of 2016. So that's the story of Gen Xers that I'm going to sort of highlight. They're investing in their education, they're investing in their housing assets. But there's some factors that are making it more difficult for some to do this than others, such as their educational attainment. The Gen X, so the Gen Xers, this is the generation that is raising and having kids and working and preparing for their retirement. So the one thing that they're doing is they're investing in their kids. So according to the Survey of Financial Security, we see that, okay, we look at all of our Gen X family, Gen X households, and about 70% of them were families. So the other 30% were people living alone. Among this, 77% of them had kids. Okay, so now cutting into that, a little more than half of them had an RESP, and a little less than half of them did not have an RESP. So there's sort of a difference between what's going on underlying this, that some families are investing in RESPs and others are not. And I don't pull apart every single possible reason, but one of them clearly is going to be how much tax or how much after-tax income they have to invest in RESPs. And it's pretty clear here that the families that have RESPs have a higher after-tax income than those that are not able to do that. The other thing that Gen Xers are doing is investing in their retirement. The graph on the left shows a similar synthetic cohort analysis to the ones that I showed you before. And again, in terms of a person's retirement pensions, and this includes the present value of employer pensions as well, is ratcheted in here. So this isn't all just the bank accounts and stuff. So employer pensions are included here. We see that also increasing across generations. With baby boomers at 55 to 64 having more money in their pension asset than the older generation did, and the Generation X having more in their pension asset than the boomers did. So that's interesting, and I think probably a positive storyline. But again, on the right panel, there's this massive variation in who has pension assets. 26% of 40 to 49-year-olds in 2016, so this is our Generation Xers, did not have pension assets at all, according to the Survey of Financial Security, and the median's much lower than the lucky few that have pension assets at the 90th percentile. And finally, the boomers. So the boomers are often seen as a privileged generation, and I guess what I'll give you as a high level here is basically, if you look at their statistics, that's true. Yet, there's massive variation again in the outcomes of boomers. This picture here shows pension assets, but the picture a little bit earlier, right there, the second line from the right showed, net worth. The main takeaway is that there's, again, a very large variance in the asset holdings of different types of families. And here it shows that the unattached are much less likely to have pension assets than boomers and families. And that makes sense, as if you have multiple adults, you have multiple opportunities for making savings. There are a couple implications of all of this in terms of the boomers story. One is that if you look at boomers' assets, the 90th percentile of boomers' assets is over $2 million, which means that the boomers are, and we hear about this in the news, about this sort of preparation for the big transmission of this wealth to the next generation. And we often worry about intergenerational income mobility, but this sort of suggests that there's also space for a concern about intergenerational wealth mobility, and how these boomers are going to cash out this wealth in the end is kind of an important question. The second thing to keep in mind is that more and more people are living longer, and a lot more often, your last years are spent in some kind of care facility. And the fact that there's a good chunk of boomers that are aging into a pensionless retirement, assetless retirement, where they won't be able to afford the same kind of care as other boomers with good nest eggs will. And I think that's important as well. So that's it. How are the balance sheets of Canadians? I think my good answer is it depends. It depends on who you are. It depends on what your human capital assets are. It depends on perhaps on how you were born, as Ray showed in his first presentation there. I show that assets and debts and net worth are rising over time and across generation, but my main message is that we cannot paint these generations with a single brush. There's a tremendous amount of variability. And I gave you little storylines about millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers, but I think I won't repeat that now because I just told it to you. All right, so thanks very much.